Sorry about the interruption. That was too important. I had to take it. So, we were talking about science-based, risk-based practices. It's not just about data and trying to prevent any possible food safety issue ever that could occur. It really has to be about balancing risks. What is a reasonable risk to protect the public from? And if you try to protect the public from every risk and sample every single piece of food to make sure it's safe, there's no food left to eat. You can't sample everything. So there has to be a balancing act. There has to be some compromise that is realistic. Also, it has to be flexible. Whatever implementations that we've come to has to allow small farms to comply. We're past that window now, but certainly that was a big deal, trying to make sure that small farms were given a little more latitude to get up to speed on FSMA. Alternatives for variant and variance provisions. So recognizing the fact that not every single operation is what we picture in our head. There can be very unusual situations. So maybe you're doing aquaculture where you're growing fish and hydroponic vegetables in a paired way called aquaponics. Is that what we picture when we think of agriculture? No. What about any other types of manufacturing or food production practices that are unusual? Is the system flexible enough where there are reasonable ways for people to comply when they're not doing things that are more traditional, more cookie cutter? Certainly diversity of operations, the size of operations, the types of practices, the crops. Again, that goes into the flexibility issue that I just discussed. The proposed safety rule draws on the FDA's past experiences with the current level, the then current level of GMPs, hazard analysis and critical control points, which we'll talk about later, HACCP programs. And not going to worry about the shell egg regulation. So it covers not only farming operations domestically, but also imported produce. So you can't just say, well, I don't want to comply, so I'm going to grow stuff in Canada. There are certain exemptions for size and qualified exemption, but that doesn't mean you can provide food that is not safe just because you're a small operation. Exemptions just mean that the rules are a little different for extremely small operations because they might not be able to comply in the same way as a larger agricultural company. And when I say small, these exemptions are for extremely small operations. So the organic regulations, food safety requires organic integrity, meaning that these food safety regulations should not mandate practices that would make the product no longer organic. So for example, you can't impose some sort of a food safety practice that forces a grower to use a chemical that is not organically approved. And that's really important. You got to keep organic integrity. But what is considered organic and not organic, I think there's a lot of misinformation about that. A lot of people think organic means no chemicals. No, organic means approved chemicals, chemicals that have made it to the approved list. And in most cases, antibiotics are not organic. In some cases, antibiotics have been approved and are allowed under organic regulations. The NOP, the National Organics Program Board, makes these decisions annually to modify or not modify the list of approved organic materials and chemicals. And so they need to take into consideration food safety as well. But one of the biggest issues is manure and compost. We've already talked about that. Record keeping. If the National Organic Program records contain required info, there's no need to duplicate for FSMA. So in other words, if you already document something that is required under the law, the newer law called FSMA, you don't have to recreate documents or create new documents for FSMA compliance. You don't have to reinvent the wheel or redo a whole new set of paperwork. You've already done it for your NOP, for your organic certification. If you're already showing documentation that's required, you're done. You might have to submit the same documentation again. You might need to give copies of that to a food safety auditor, but that's it. You're just giving copies to show you're already documenting these required records for food safety. If it's not under the NOP requirements, then yes, you do need to add additional documentation to comply with FSMA. There's technical assistance available both through federal agencies as well as private organizations that are providing outreach services. The FSMA operations teams are important members of this outreach, certainly. There was and continues to be revisions for comment periods, allowing farmers and the public to give their points of view and comment on the updates that were proposed back at this time. And this is largely when I would argue that a lot of the final changes, updates, details were written into the FSMA regulations. The law wasn't changing, it was the regulation portion. It was how do you comply with the law? What do you need to do as a grower to show that you are following the rules? And so it was really the compliance portion that needed some tweaking and needed some comments. There were timeframes placed on FSMA to make sure that it was being implemented, and the federal government as well as growers had to follow these timelines being imposed by the courts. Updated good ag practices, certainly updates have been implemented, and you can find these on the FDA's website. But we've already talked about the 1998 guide regarding the microbial food safety. That's kind of the baseline when we're talking about FSMA, but a lot of data, obviously, and a lot of details have come since 1998. Even though this is the baseline, the foundation science, we've built a ton of information on top of that, and you can get some really good update information from the FDA and the USDA regarding GAPs. Again, this is just other technical assistance methods, ways that they're reaching out, organizations, etc., that can help growers, students, whoever needs to know more, wants to know more about these changes in GAPs in food safety. nothing more I really want to add here other than to say that, you know, there are specific auditors, both federally employed as well as privately employed. If you're a privately employed auditor and you're doing it for the USDA, you need to be certified. You need to have that training and certification to show that you are qualified and authorized to perform these audits. If you're doing it for a private company, you still are going to be required. Any private company that's going to hire an auditor is going to want that auditor to be certified to the standards. Often it's a global GAP certification that companies are looking for these days. So again, there were talking points for the speaker that authored this presentation. I'm not going to worry about this. Doesn't really have anything to add. And that's it. That's it for a recap of the GAPs